To have dawn, there must first be dark. Blackness warmed by the glow of light. To have dreams, there must first be man. Dreamers warmed by a legend beyond their sight. So where begins the time of California? 200 years? To the night, the stars, the sun, and the sea, a mere ripple on the ocean of time. But to the dreamer, to man, and I hear the voices singing, Indian voices singing of the beginning, singing of how all the land was once covered by a great flood. One day, land rose up from the water and became the earth. And a great river hurled the earth into the sea. Age upon age, the mighty river slowly built a broad delta and formed two great bays. The water of the earth and the water of the sea uniting to fulfill a rendezvous with man, building into a land that began as a legend and has been a legend ever since. Building into a place called San Diego, where California began. So where began the legend of California? Since the dream is a part of man, let us begin with man. It is not known exactly when the ancestors of the Indians arrived, but they found a lush, green land, a land covered with shrubbery and trees. The Indians settled near the waters of the streams and rivers, and gradually their numbers increased. Living in small bands, each tribe fished and hunted and gathered seeds in its own territory, where the warm sun and green land made life easy and happy. But how often the destinies of man are blown on unseen winds. For the Indians of the Southland, their destiny appeared riding the winds of a Spanish ship. In two small caravels, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo came up from the land called New Spain, came to search for the fabled Northwest Passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and the legendary 7 cities of Cibola. Cabrillo, Portuguese by birth, captain of Spain, told of finding an unknown port.
On the following Thursday, we went about 6 leagues along a coast running north-northwest and discovered a port, enclosed and very good, which we named San Miguel. Having cast anchor in the year of our Lord 1542, we went ashore where there were people. To these we gave gifts.
After remaining for 6 days, Cabrillo sailed north from the port he had discovered, sailed on, never to return. But the dreams remained. And to the ocean called the South Sea came other men mapping routes and seeking riches. Captain Sebastián Vizcaíno sailed north from New Spain, first to locate the fabled gold, silver, and pearls of California, and second, to explore the coast for suitable harbors. Under no circumstances was he to change the names already on the map.
Not change the names. Talk to the wind, not to a soldier of Spain. Not when the harbor is entered at the very time of the feast of the Franciscan friar Saint Dedicus, San Diego de Alcalá.
And so it was that the port of San Miguel, on the 12th of November 1602, became the harbor of San Diego. Then, for the next 167 years, perhaps a fleck of the Manila galleons on the far horizon. Nothing more. By the middle of the 18th century, men of other nations, especially Russians, had discovered the land called California. The Spanish court expressed its alarm at the growing interest of foreign nations in land considered to be part of New Spain. A decision was reached to protect the land by establishing permanent colonies in the north, beginning at the harbor of San Diego. The Visitor General to New Spain, José de Galvez, in compliance with the royal concern, sent 2 ships by sea and an expedition by land with instructions to establish military presidios and church missions. Captain Gaspar de Portola would command the military, and the Franciscan Padre, Junípero Serra, would establish the missions. And on the sea, how wide the great Pacific, how crude the ancient maps. After wandering many weeks, the 2 ships at last found the harbor of San Diego, most of their crews dead or dying of scurvy. 2 weeks later, Captain Fernando de Moncada y Rivera, leader of the advanced land expeditions, and Father Juan Crespi, topped the crest of a coastal hill and looked upon the 2 ships riding the waters of the Silver Bay. Late the following month, Portola led his own weary men into the camp of the sick and dying. Arriving a little later on July 1st, Father Serra spoke of the scene.
Here I met all who had set out before me, whether by sea or by land, but not the dead.
On July the 16th, 1769, suspended between the unknown land and the unfriendly sea, a cross was raised on Presidio Hill, and Father Serra gave voice to God. This was the beginning of San Diego. The next 4 years were very difficult for the mission. All attempts to irrigate the meager land around the fortress hill met with failure. And trouble developed between the soldiers and Indians. Thus it was that in August of 1774, the mission was moved up the valley to a bend of the river 6 miles away from the Presidio. For the next 2 years, under the direction of Father Luis Jaime, Christianity was brought to the Diegueño Indians. But while some found Christian love, others found only resentment and hate. And in early November of 1775, the mission was attacked by several hundred Indians. When Father Jaime tried to intervene, his trust was bitterly betrayed. Thus, Father Jaime became California's first martyr. Of his death, Father Serra said,
"The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church."
From that day, the mission prospered. Although the threat of Indian attack lasted for many years, new buildings were constructed of adobe and tile, and orchards and crops were planted. But now water became a problem for the mission. To provide water for irrigation, the padres, with Indian labor, constructed a dam of stone and cement at the head of Mission Gorge on the San Diego River. For its day, the dam was a marvel of construction. But more of a marvel was the building of an open tile aqueduct through almost 6 miles of rocky canyon and open plain to the fields in Mission Valley. By the early 1800s, when the age of the missions reached its peak, lands of the San Diego Mission encompassed 3,000 square miles, lands of orchards, farms, and vineyards, lands with thousands of cattle, horses, and sheep. The Christian Indians were taught skills. From morning to night, their lives were regimented by the sound of the mission bell. But now, many British, Russian, and Yankee ships were combing the coast of the Californias for the valuable fur of the sea otter. From the worried viceroy of New Spain came the stern command: no foreign trading ships in California ports. But when Spanish supply ships failed to arrive, Could the Californians help it if a foreign ship was always conveniently there? And the foreign ships carried goods to barter for California furs and cattle hides. Then, in 1821, after bitter fighting, New Spain at last won its independence from the Spanish. The following spring, the proud flag of Mexico was raised over the little presidio of San Diego. Now the people began to leave the protection of the fort, and gradually, the Pueblo de San Diego grew up around the plaza at the foot of Presidio Hill. Under Mexico, trade with foreigners flourished, and soon the decks of foreign ships became the marketplace of California. A fiesta, or baile, celebrated the arrival of each trading ship, and while Spanish guitars wove the steps of the jarabe, the fandango, and the contradanza, the eyes of the Spanish ladies were wreaking havoc among the Americans. Many deserted their life at sea and became Californianos of the land. But while the men of the sea were welcome, the men of the mountains were not. The Californianos feared an overland trail from the land of the Yankees.
By the sea, the numbers are small, of no consequence. But should an overland trail be open to California, we fear that the hordes of Yankees would sweep all before them to the sea.
So it was that in 1826, Jedediah Smith and his party of fur trappers, after blazing a trail across mountain and desert, received a cold reception and were ordered out of California. 2 years later, James Ohio Patty and his party of trappers blazed a new trail through the deserts of the south to San Diego, where they were promptly jailed. For the next several decades, other events occupied the fiery Californianos, and periodic battles erupted between rival towns for political control of the location of the office of governor and the custom house. By 1833, however, sparks from the fires of dissension destroyed forever the authority of the missions and lighted the way for the pastoral days of the Dons. Secularize, said Mexico. Strip the land and cattle from the missions. Grant them to those who had been loyal to the government of Mexico. Reduce the missions to parish churches. Cast the Indians to the winds. Now the 21 missions of California began a long period of neglect and decay. But while the missions wept, the ranchos grew fat with cattle, and the rancheros found a ready Yankee market for their vast herds of mission cattle. Now the trading ships were loaded with bundles of hides. Now the ships rode low with the weight of barrels of tallow. Now the people of the ranchos grew heavy with satin, silk, and lace, grew rich with the goods of the world, paid for with cattle hides called California banknotes.
People came from many leagues for bailes and weddings. Strangers were welcome at our fiestas, which lasted for many days. There was much gambling. Bear and bullfights were very popular. What did it matter if you lost? Would not the Yankees always want the hides of our cattle?
By the 1840s, time had run out for the rancheros. Political unrest, the decimation of the cattle herds, and the dying away of the Yankee demand for hides spelled the end of the good years. As governors came and governors went, the cauldron of political revolt against the rule of Mexico led to one rebellion after another.
The battle cry was, California for the Californios!
By the 1840s, war between Mexico and the United States loomed on the Texas border. By this time, parts of California were heavily settled by Americans, and many of the Californianos looked to the United States for a more stable government. Governor Pio Pico, the last of the Mexican governors, was sure that war would come. So he made large grants of land. In San Diego, some ranches had more than 150,000 acres. In 1846, it happened. War between the United States and Mexico. On the 29th of July, the United States sloop of war, Cyane, sailed into the port to capture the Mexican town of San Diego. On board, Major John Charles Fremont commanded a battalion of California volunteers. The next day, there was no opposition when the Americans raised their flag in the village plaza. 10 days later, Fremont led his victorious army northward, leaving a small force to hold the town. For the next 4 months, Californianos loyal to Mexico fought minor skirmishes with those who sided with the Americans. The town was finally secured when the USS Congress sailed into the harbor, with Commodore Robert Stockton as supreme commander of operations on the coast. Then the news arrived. The Army of the West, commanded by General Kearny and guided by Kit Carson, after conquering New Mexico, was marching out of the desert to the aid of Stockton. And waiting in the valley of San Pascual was Andrés Pico and his California Caballeros, among the best horsemen in the world, waiting with lance and gun. The weary American dragoons were no match for the flashing Californianos, and the long lances took a heavy toll, but it was the Californianos who fled the fields of battle. 4 days later, the harassed dragoons were holding out on Mule Hill when reinforcements came from San Diego. But lance and gun cannot dam a rising tide. And in 1847, the Californians signed the capitulation of Cahuenga Pass, which delivered California into the hands of the Americans. Thus, the principal objective of the war with Mexico had been achieved. Later that year, the men of the Mormon Battalion completed one of the longest military treks in history, all the way from Council Bluffs, Iowa, to San Diego. More important, they carved a wagon trail to the west. Then, from out of the north, the cry that has created empires.
Gold! Gold in California! Gold!
Soon a flood of men with dreams of sudden wealth poured across the Great Divide. Far to the south, blazing under the eternal sun, the dons of San Diego again heard the cry for cattle. Now came the time of the great cattle drives, northward to the flowing gold. And suddenly San Diego had a new prosperity. And now on the bay, whaling stations were in full operation. This was the time when the man called Kanaka Bill Davis stepped off his ship, and with others bought 160 acres near the waterfront and had streets laid out for a community called Newtown. Then he waited for the stampede of settlers from Old Town, and he waited and waited. And soon the name of Newtown was changed to Davis's Folly. No, they did not leave the adobes of Old Town. Instead, they built the Whaley House, the Pendleton House, and the Gila House. But this was the frontier of the 1850s, and violence was the order of the day. Gunfights, gambling, robbery, murders, and vigilantes. San Diego had them all. And San Diego had a river that spewed torrents of silt and sand into the glistening bay. Because of the river, San Diego got Lieutenant George Horatio Derby of the Army's topographical engineers. His job? To build the first earthen dike to divert the San Diego River into Mission Bay. The idea of diverting the river would eventually save the harbor. But the town was booming and the people wanted yet another miracle. Give us a railroad, they said. A freight route to the goods of the East. Let us end San Diego's isolation. Instead of a railroad, in 1857, an overland mail and passenger stage service was established between San Antonio, Texas and San Diego. But because of the rugged coastal mountains, mules had to be used for the last part of the journey to Old Town. The newspapers of the North laughed and called it the Jackass Mail. In 1858, coaches of the famous Butterfield stage line headed west from Missouri. And San Diego hoped that at last it would have direct and comfortable transportation to the east. But at Warner's Ranch, stages turned north to Los Angeles and San Francisco. Once again, the rocky coastal mountains had blocked the flow of trade and settlers. Still, San Diego prospered and grew on cattle, whaling, and shipping. Then, in 1861, disaster struck. First, the Civil War cut off the flow of immigrants and ruined the whaling industry. Then came the worst flood in the history of San Diego, followed by a devastating drought. Years of disaster not only spelled the end of prosperity, it also ended the days of the Dons, this time forever. But the end of the Civil War saw thousands of immigrants on the trails to the west. And to San Diego came prosperity in the form of a Yankee merchant named Alonzo Horton. It was Horton who created the first big real estate boom in San Diego. He purchased 1,000 acres of land in Newtown, which at that time was nothing but brush and rocks. His price, 27.5 cents an acre. Then he erected buildings and a new wharf. With the land promising sudden wealth, Newtown came alive. It was at this time that the far-sighted Board of Trustees set aside 1,400 acres for what was later to be named Balboa Park. But the expected industry failed to arrive. Just when it seemed that the boom would burst, gold was discovered in the Cuyamaca Mountains, and suddenly San Diego had a new dream, a dream called gold. Almost overnight, the mining town of Julian sprang into existence. But temporary prosperity brought by the gold of Julian helped to change the face of San Diego. Horton House, the city's first modern hotel, with hot and cold running water, became the social center of the community. Through the marvels of electricity, downtown could be viewed from open-air electric cars. And now came the world-famous Hotel del Coronado, which eventually knew such celebrities as the Prince of Wales and 5 presidents of the United States of America. Then, the great boom of the 80s was threatened by San Diego's ancient nemesis. Once more, the land echoed with the age-old cry,
Water! We've got to have more water!
In response to their demands, a number of water companies were formed. On mountainous Boulder Creek, construction of Cuyamaca Dam was started, and a wooden flume, 36 miles long, was built to channel the clean mountain water to San Diego. The day the flume opened was a day of celebration, with officials and visitors floating down the flume in wooden boats. Later, the completion of Sweetwater Dam provided water for National City and Chula Vista. But in the midst of creating the future, the boom ended as suddenly as it had begun. By the end of the 1880s, the people of San Diego had more water than at any time in their history, and almost nobody to drink it. In less than 6 months, the population dropped from 35,000 to 16,000. But San Diego still had men of vision, men such as George W. Marston, Ed Fletcher, and John D. Spreckels, who would build the long-awaited railroad to the east. It took 12 years to push the railroad through granite mountains and yawning gorges to top the transcontinental lines near the Colorado. But eventually, John D. Spreckels did drive in the last spike. After almost 150 years, San Diego had a railroad connection to the east, and its isolation would end, or so it thought. But it also would prove to be merely another disappointing branch line. But while work on the railroad had been going on, the bay was still king, because the Spanish-American War had brought the Pacific Fleet, marking the beginning of a great Navy tradition in San Diego. But prosperity thrives on industry, and the California-Panama Exposition of 1915, which celebrated the opening of the Panama Canal, was also supposed to celebrate San Diego's beginning as the trade center of the Pacific. After all, it was only logical that ships coming through the canal would stop at San Diego. But the ships went right on by to Los Angeles. The exposition did, however, open the world-renowned San Diego Zoo. Then, in 1916, a prolonged drought threatened the end of prosperity. But a rainmaker by the name of Charles Hatfield promised to fill the city's reservoirs Whether because of Hatfield or not, it poured. The rain not only filled the reservoirs, it broke a dam, it flooded the rivers, it destroyed farms. When the rain finally stopped, once more San Diego found itself cut off from the world. But as always, the town that wouldn't give up made a quick recovery. With the coming of World War I, San Diego found that its Great Bay had become one of the most important naval bases in the world. Because of San Diego's nearly perfect weather, and the early 20s began famous flying service and airplane company, where Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis was delivered in just 60 days. But locked as it was between the mountains and the sea, it had long been recognized that if the city was to grow, it must cross the mountains to the Colorado River for water. In 1921, two men from San Diego chugged over the mountains into the desert. And under old Spanish law of first in time, first in right, placed a marker on the river. This action assured water for the future of San Diego. The destiny of San Diego seemed always to be linked with water. Thus, it was only natural that in the 1920s, it became the tuna capital of the world. The fishing industry, which had gradually changed from Chinese to Portuguese, was using large ocean-going ships and ranging thousands of miles at sea. Then came the Depression of the 1930s, and again, San Diego refused to give up. The California Pacific Exposition of 1935 not only promoted tourism and industry, it also brought additional buildings and gardens to Balboa Park. And it would be the airplane, as well as ships, that finally would open the last door on the city's long isolation. By the end of the 30s, San Diego had taken its place in the sun. A place built on the heritage of the Indians, the explorers, the Dons, the Vaqueros, the ranchos, the missions. A heritage of Indian culture and tradition reaching to the dawn of time. A heritage of Spain in language, cattle, food, music, and law. A heritage of Mexico in custom, richness of ornamentation, hospitality, courtesy, and the good life. A heritage of America in industry, enterprise, and love of freedom. A heritage of names that ring through the years of history, leading to the fabled golden destiny of a land that began as a legend and has been a legend ever since. San Diego, where California began, shimmering across 200 years. San Diego, a name that will always mean romance, adventure, opportunity, and the very best of the good life.